firstly, we should start with, well, what is pointing out? What is the introduction? And now that you've talked a little bit about Rigpa, that might be a foundation for that question.
The phase in which the so-called pointing out instructions are given in the context of Dzogchen is the first major phase of Dzogchen practice, which is called in Tibetan tekchur, which means to cut through something rigid, something hard, something not malleable. And what we're cutting through, if we go to the most authoritative sources like Garab Dorje, the first human teacher of Dzogchen in this historical era, what you're actually cutting through is not just the limitations of your human mind. To cut through that all you need is shamatha, and you can be a Hindu, you can be anything. You don't need to be a Dzogchen practitioner or a Buddhist to cut through this mind that arises in dependence upon the brain but is never generated by chemicals and electricity. It's a preposterous notion. If anybody just pause for a moment, as Thomas Huxley, the great 19th century biologist, commented, the notion that you could stimulate neurons and have consciousness pop out is about as reasonable and scientific as thinking you can rub a lamp and having a genie pop out. So enough with magical thinking and non-scientific thinking, unscientific thinking. The human mind emerges from a primal flow of consciousness. It's subtler frequency, so to speak. But beyond that is this non-local, atemporal, pristine awareness, and you need to cut through that substrate consciousness to actually access that in a sustainable way. This can be done in a myriad of ways. When Naropa was receiving his pointing out instructions in the context of Mahamudra from his guru, Tilopa, what actually was a catalyst for him to cut through and realize pristine awareness was getting a whack in the face with a sandal. And then suddenly he was jolted out of his ordinary perspective of non-lucidity in the waking state to lucidity in the waking state, waking up in the context of what we call the waking state. And so it can be something like that. It can be something occurring in nature. It can be reading a text. Tsongkhapa said, for example, wasn't cutting through to Rigpa, but gaining a realization of emptiness. It was while he was reading a text by Buddha Palita, a great Indian master of Madhyamaka. He's reading, and that was his catalyst for breaking through conventional reality to ultimate reality of emptiness. I've known this story for a long time, that he was reading a text by Buddha Palita, and in the context of that, that's when he had his breakthrough to realizing emptiness. But it can happen in a myriad of ways, and in the classic mind-to-mind transmission, receiving point out instructions, so you come into the presence of a realized Lama who has identified Rigpa for him or herself, and everybody sits down, they calm the mind, they're open their awareness, they're kind of hovering without locked into hope and fear, expectation, or caught up in cogitation. And then on that occasion, it can be through symbolic act. It very often is by way of words, but the words are speaking. I'll put it this way. When a Lama who has genuine realization has identified, motupa means identify, non-dually identified his or her own pristine awareness, speaking from that dimension of consciousness, this ultimate ground state of awareness, where the words emerge spontaneously and effortlessly, not premeditated, not caught up in concepts, but just like bubbles flowing up from the bottom of an aquarium and then popping spontaneously when they come to the surface. The Lama's words will just flow forth spontaneously emerging from the Lama's own pristine awareness. The words come out and strike the minds of those listening, and it is the words from the Lama's pristine awareness speaking to the pristine awareness of those listening. And if they can listen from that perspective, that opens the door, that cuts through their dualistic ordinary mind, and it catalyzes, it enables their own Rigpa to realize, to recognize itself. So this happens many times, but now, and for many people, from a great master like the late Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche, Dujun Rinpoche, and so many others, Yang Chen Rinpoche, who passed away just a few years ago, Lamas of such majesty and such profound realization, one may indeed cut through by receiving such pointing out instructions, the motupa, and you may have a genuine identification. But then what? And in many, many cases, people, an hour, a day, a week, a month after the event, they may look upon that experience in the presence of this extraordinary Lama See, that was the most meaningful experience of my whole life. It was life-changing. And then we can ask, and we're able to sustain it? And in the great majority of cases, the answer is no. It was very transformative, but no. And so once again, coming back and saying sustainability, 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 we may have insights into personal identitylessness, insights into emptiness, shunyata, insights or identification of Rigpa. But unless the soil has been prepared, unless we have profoundly cultivated the mind by way of the higher training of samadhi, and specifically shamatha and vipassana, so that we don't gain some insight into Rigpa and then reify it and turn it into an object and then, of course, obliterate the immediate experience or identification. For that identification of Rigpa to be sustainable, we must have some insight into emptiness, the emptiness of Rigpa itself. And for that to be sustainable, we must have shamatha. And for that to be sustainable, we must have an exquisitely ethical way of life, rooted deeply and finely in the principles of nonviolence and benevolence. So sustainability comes back. Many people idealize, oh, if I can only receive pointing out instructions, pointing out instructions. Well, many people go there and they don't get it. They just sit there, is it over yet? You know? And some people do get it, but then what's the half-life of your identification? So this is where we come back to the groundwork. That if such an identification of Rigpa is to be profoundly and radically and enduringly sustainable, that it shifts the whole way we are present in the world and view reality every moment of the day, it has to have deep roots. And that has to be in the wisdom of prajna, a realization of emptiness, that in samadhi, and that in ethics. So no getting around it. We're always looking for shortcuts. I would love to find shortcuts. But there's no shortcut to ethics, there's no shortcut to samadhi, there's no shortcut to wisdom, and there's no shortcut to sustainable identification.